Hey everybody, I was trying to make some level design mechanics and was having a little bit of trouble finding a good tutorial on how to do a bounce pad that could work on both characters and physics objects. So what I mean by this is I want to be able to drop a crate on a bounce pad and have it bounce away into the level, but I also want to be able to use that as my player character, and I just feel like that would give a lot more options in terms of level design and allow me to open up more interesting kind of mechanics. So I couldn't find a good tutorial on it, so I thought I would put one together, but this is what it would look like just to show you. We have any kind of physics actor that will apply an impulse and you can just bounce it. You could push it into the bounce pad if you want, or you could use it as a character. It's angled, so it'll work in different directions, or we can just, bounce it off. But I figured this would allow in level design to just bounce any kind of character, any kind of physics object. And, to me, that's pretty interesting. You can do a whole lot with that in puzzle design. So I'll show you how to put this simple little thing together. You can see it doesn't, look amazing, but it's just for prototype and just to get the functionality. So if you want an overview of our approach, just, if you're trying to decide if you want to go through this whole tutorial or not, what I'm going to do is I'm going to end up casting to a character, meaning that we should be able to launch any kind of character, if it's third person, first person, whatever. As long as you make a character, we can launch it. We're going to launch it in a certain direction. And if it's not a character, but it does have a component, so it's generating overlap, then we'll just add an impulse. So basically, if it's a character, we're going to do launch character. If it's not, we're going to do add impulse, and we can control the strength of those separately. And either way, we're going to play a sound effect. So this is the overview of our approach, but we'll go through it and build it one step at a time. So here we go. So in terms of scene setup, I'm just using the default third person character scene, the template when you create a new project. So it's pretty empty. You can see that there's some physics actors over here. These are just the default ones that come with it, but it is useful to have something for testing. So we're going to build a little jump pad over here. And when we press play, our character can come over and use it. I think it's worth mentioning that this should work no matter what kind of character you're using. As long as it's a character, we'll launch it with that blueprint. And if it's not a character, it will launch a physics actor. So I think this should work no matter what kind of character you have, but just to show you, I'm using the third person one, and that's how my code's going to look, but I think it'll be the same. So first things first, let's build our jump pad blueprint. Easy enough. We're just going to come over here and let's make a folder for mechanics. Let's make a new folder here. Mechanics. Inside of mechanics, we're going to make a new blueprint class. So right click, blueprint class. And this is going to be a kind of actor. We can't really control it. Our jump pad is just going to be a thing that sits in the world that does something. So it's going to be an actor. We'll say BP for blueprint underscore bounce pad. All right, so let's save it. I'm just going to save all. Anytime I make a new asset, I like to save it. It's hard to lose asset references. Double click to open it up. We're just going to use some default stuff. I have the starter content. I don't think I'm going to use any of that, but we'll see. All right, so what I need a collision for the jump pad itself. I need a overlap volume for where on that jump pad I want the bounce to be. So for example, you could have like a big springboard, but only bounce when you hit the top of it. So I want to be able to define that space. I want an arrow to show what direction this thing is going to bounce, just helpful for designers. And then I'll eventually want a sound effect, but I don't think I'm going to worry about that yet. And then if you want a particle effect, you can. I'm not really going to do that in this tutorial, but you could very easily add it as a component and trigger it. I have lots of other tutorials for that. All right, so let's make our static mesh first. We're going to go add, we'll do static mesh, static mesh. In terms of static mesh, you could honestly make this whatever you want. I'm going to make mine a cylinder because I don't have time for art at the moment. So we can just type in cylinder. All right, we'll just use the default cylinder at the top. That's fine. Let's see here. This is our root. Okay, so this is what it's going to look like when we put it in the scene. If you want to move the static mesh up so that the root is closer to the bottom, you could. I'm actually going to scale this down a little bit as well. Just make it closer to the ground. This means that the character will collide with this, the way I'm setting this up, but we want to define a section at the top that will actually control the bounce. So if we run up against it, we may not bounce depending on how our next volume is, but we want the ability to have an actual mesh model in the world that has collisions. So next we're going to make I think a sphere makes most sense instead of you could do a box. It'd be fine, but we're just going to make a sphere. We'll do sphere collision right there. And so this is going to be the zone that controls the bounce. So when we touch this zone, our character will bounce. Now, if you want them to jump on top of it versus like running up against it and colliding and then only bounce when you jump on top, then I could set it up like this. If I want it to just bounce, if I just touch the sides as well, we can just scale this up a little bit. For me, just to make my gameplay really easy and flowy, I'm gonna make my volume cover the top. I probably don't want it to go over the bottom. That could cause some weird issues. I could always make my mesh longer. Maybe I'll do that. Let's scale this out a little bit. Honestly, this part doesn't super matter. I think that's pretty good. All right, so we have our static mesh. Maybe we give it a material. I'll just do that real quick just to show you. Let's minimize this. We'll right click, go to material, M. Actually, just to show you, if you haven't done this before, we could do an M material, like just a basic material, and then make material instances if we're gonna make a lot of different mechanics. That's probably the better way to do it. But let's just make a simple one-off one in this case. What I mean is you would make one material, you define a color parameter, and then you'd make material instances to make other examples. This is just for prototype, and honestly, I don't want to make this tutorial longer than it needs to be, so we'll just do this in one material. But look into material instances if you want to know more. I'm gonna hold down V and click, and that's a hotkey to create a parameter for a color. We'll call this color. I'll plug this in to base color, and honestly, this is all we need. And give it. Actually, I'll show you the material instance. Why not? Let's do it. We'll do apply, do save. Okay, and what this means is this parameter that I made just allows me to make a material instance, actually several material instances, and then I can choose what I want that color to be, and it's a lot more optimized than having a new material for each thing that has a material. We want to make one material with all the variables for the different things that we want, and then make instances of that. So let me show you that. Let me minimize. So now that I have my basic material, I'm going to right click and say create material instance. So now I'll call this mi underscore BouncePad. So you can think about it as my material is my instructions and my material instance is my exact version of that I want. So my BouncePad material, or my ground material, or whatever. You could get a lot more complicated with this, but we're not going to do that. So open up my material instance. I'm going to change my color. So I'm going to check that to, I'll do a purple. I think that's fine. Something like that. Very peaceful, calm, relaxing. All right, so we have our color. Yeah, I think that's all we need. Let's save it. And the reason that we have access to this color is just literally, it was the parameter that we created and plugged it into color. So now we need to apply this material instance to, oh yeah, let me save everything. I did not mean to close that, but it's fine. I'm gonna hit save all just to make sure I have everything saved so far. So now we're gonna jump back into our blueprint. Sure, we'll compile. I'm gonna go back to our viewport over here so we can visualize it. Let's put our material instance that we made on our cylinder. Again, if you just want to do this with a material because that was too confusing, just make a material, give it a color, and then apply the material. It's just not as optimized long-term. mi underscore, we'll call this, what do we call it? We called it BouncePad, there we go. Material instance, so we have our static mesh, our color. You can make your own material for this, that'd be totally fine. You could have your own static mesh, that's fine too, but you would just replace it here. All right, so we have our sphere. This is going to be our bounce zone, meaning that when the character touches it, we want them to bounce. So let's set that up really quick. It actually won't take that long. What I want to do is I don't think I'm going to need any of this right here, so I'll delete it out. I can always get it back if I want, or you can just move it aside. I'm going to take my sphere component that I made. This is going to be my little collision that I added at the top of the bounce pad. So I'm going to come over here. I'm going to select my sphere. And if you scroll down on the bottom, you're going to see these events. These are events that we can make that are based off this component. So for example, when this component is hit or when this component is overlapped or whatever. I actually want this one. So if you select the component, this will work with a box collision as well. Select our sphere component and click on component begin overlap. You could find this by right clicking in the inspector, but that takes a little bit longer. So we'll just do it the fast way. So when this sphere component is overlapped with something else in the scene, we want to do things. And in this case, you want to test to see if it's a character. If it is, we want to bounce. Because maybe we don't just want to bounce the player character. Maybe we want to bounce any character, right? Like bounce enemies. Why not? We could push them into bounce pads and send them into the lava. That'd be a pretty cool mechanic. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to keep this generic. We're not going to test the player. We're going to test if this is a character. So when some other thing overlaps with our sphere component, we need to determine, is that other thing valid? To do that, we're going to drag off of other character. So it's the other thing that touched this sphere component on our bounce pad. Other actor, we're going to cast a character. So what this means is, type this in, cast a character. Make sure that we plug in the execution pin at the top and the other character right here. This says, is the other thing that touched this a type of character, right? If it's a pawn, it's not going to work. If it's a, an actor, it's not going to work. But if it is a character, so enemy characters, player characters, whatever, then we want to launch it. So next step is as character, drag off of as character, and now we can do character specific things. One specific thing that we can do with characters is we can launch. We can't launch all actors, but we can launch character actors. So I'm going to type in launch character after I drag off of as character and click launch character. The reason is because with characters, movement is a little bit more complex. We use the character movement component, and we have to simulate a lot of physics. It can move on moving platforms. It can do jumping. It's just more complex. So we need to launch it through this way. Whereas with physics actors, which we'll do in a little bit, we just add a force. But characters are more complicated, so we're going to test to see if this is a character. If so, launch a character. It's a proper way to do it. Now, we don't just want to launch a character. We want to launch a character in a certain direction. So actually, I'm going to compile, save, and I'm going to come back into my viewport over here. I think the designer might want to know what direction this pad is going to launch the character. So let's add something here called a arrow component. Yeah, arrow. There we go. And so what this arrow is going to do, I'm actually going to rotate it in the up direction. So just drag it up, hit E, rotate it 90 degrees so it's pointing. So the designer can actually see this arrow if we allow them to, and they can see what direction this bounce pad is going to send the player. The player doesn't have to see this. We could communicate that with visuals later on, but the designer may need to know if they're launching the character different directions. We're going to launch in this direction. So I'm going to compile, save. We will jump back over into the event graph. All right, so now we actually need to launch the character a certain direction, right? Because we're launching the character, but right now we're launching them in 0, 0, 0, which is not really anything. We want to launch them in the up direction, so that the local up direction actually, so that we can rotate the bounce pads in different angles and send them different directions. So you could imagine if we were trying to draw a line to determine how we're going to launch the character. If I come back over here in my viewport, we want to launch them in a direction, but we also want to determine how strong we want to push them in that direction too. So we need to get a direction and multiply that by a strength. So instead of drawing this little line right here, so this is just a direction and visualizes, want a direction times a strength to draw a longer line, and that'll determine, where we're pushing them. So I think that different bounce pads may need different strengths and, how strong are we going to bounce a character? So I think we're going to need to make a variable for that. If you want to keep it consistent across all bounce pads, you totally could, but we need a direction and a strength. And I'm going to open that up in a variable for the designer to control. So to do that, let's just go ahead and make our variable over here. We're going to click the plus button. Let's call this character bounce strength. Okay. And we're going to change this to a type of float. A float just gives us a lot of control. So decimal points, and we can fine tune that however we want. We do want the designer to see it. So I'm going to click the little eyeball, meaning that we can mess with it in the inspector. Sorry, the details panel, we call it in Unreal. Let's see, instance editable, yes. Category, we can make a category, but I don't think we need to yet. Everything else is fine. Let's give it a default value though. And the reason we're not seeing that is because we need to compile. I honestly don't remember what my default value is in the example. So let's try like 1,000. Let's try that. Compile, save. All right, so this is our strength, but we're not actually using it. So now we want to get our up direction, our local up direction on our bounce pad, and then we're going to multiply that direction by our strength and then plug that into launch velocity. Easy way to do this is if we want the up direction on this actor that we're currently doing our blueprint on, just right click and say get actor. We can say up, we can say forward, we can say a lot of different things, but in this case we want up direction, up vector, same thing. So get actor up vector, and then we want to drag in our character bounce strength, say get character bounce strength. And we want to multiply these two things together. So our direction times an amount will draw a longer line in that direction. So we're going to drag off of this and say multiply. Okay. And then we're going to plug in our character bounce strength to the bottom, and it'll just auto convert the node for us. So direction times an amount will give us a final velocity that we can pull into there. Okay, cool. Now, another thing I want, and this is kind of up to you at this point, you could either add to the character's current velocity to like bounce multiple times and build up momentum. But I think for more control, for the kind of level that I want to make, I just want to override it and say, look, if you're hitting this bounce volume at max speed, I'm just going to reset your velocity so I have more careful control of how I bounce. Because I think at my level, I want the flow of it. I want to control that. So I want to bounce them onto a particular platform or something. They can steer it while they're in midair a bit, but I want to override. So that's what these do. I want to override, in this case, all the directions. You could override a certain direction if you want, but I'm going to override all directions. But that's what that's doing. It's saying reset the velocity when we bounce instead of add to and build it up. I think that'll work. Let's actually test it out. Compile, save. Make sure your default is set to something. So like 1000, minimize, make sure we're all saved up, and take our blueprint, drag it into the scene. You can see our arrow. All right, hit play. Over here. Boom. All right, so we can bounce. That's cool. I think we need a sound effect. I think long-term we'll need a particle, but at the very least, we'll do a sound effect. We'll tackle that next. But we know that it's functional as a good first step. So for our sound effects, you can totally grab your own. You can go to, I think I've talked about this in other tutorials, but like chip tone and make your own placeholders. I have a little bounce sound effect that I've made previously that I'm just going to reuse. So however you do your sound effect, like whether you just make a prototype sound, just drag it in. Make sure it's a wave so that Unreal can read it. It may need some other things, but just make sure that you can import it. You can preview it. Right? Pretty simple. Once I drag it in, I'm going to right click and say create a cue from it because I want to add slight variation on it. We'll just press enter, keep that the same. I'm going to save all so that I save all my new assets that I made. I'm going to double click the cue and I'm just going to do one quick little thing here. I'm going to drag a modulator in. Okay, so this way we can plug in the output, plug out the output into there. Okay, so now when we click our modulator, we'll have slight variation on our pitch and our volume, which is great. The other thing I want to do is if I click off, I want to turn down the attenuation. The default is like crazy big. I don't want that. So I'm going to tick the override attenuation, scroll down to where it says fall off distance. I'm going to change to something more like, I don't know, like 2000 is still pretty big, but it's a gameplay mechanic. Maybe that's important. We'll save it. So again, override attenuation, go down to 2000. Oh, is that 20,000? Ooh, that's 20,000. That's way too big. 2000. There we go. All right, we'll save it, minimize it. All right, so we're gonna come in here. We need to actually play the sound effect in our blueprint. So let's do that. Now that we have our cue made, go back to wherever you put it. So in this case, mechanics. Actually, I'm gonna make a folder here. We'll call this BouncePad. I may end up adding more mechanics later, so we'll just put all this stuff in there. You could organize this a different way if you keep your materials in one place, for example, but simplicity for tutorial. Open that up. All right, so let's jump back. I was gonna say bounce back into our blueprint over here. Here we go. Cast a character. Now, once we launch our character, we know that this is working. We're gonna say play sound. And actually, I wanna play sound at location because if other things are using my bounce pad, I don't wanna play that 2D, right? If we bounce a crate on a bounce pad, if that's on the other side of the level, I don't want to hear that. That's gonna be very annoying. So I'm gonna say play sound at location so that we can actually like limit the range of the sound effect. So play sound at location. We're gonna choose our bounce cue that we just made. Make sure you check the bounce cue so that we get our special settings and variation we made. In terms of where we want to play the sound, I think we just want to play it at the location of this bounce pad, right? That makes the most sense to me. So I'm just gonna say, I'm gonna right click, get actor location. So get the location of the actor that this blueprint is currently on, which is the bounce pad. So we'll plug that in just like that. Compile, save, awesome. All right, let's test it out. I don't think we've done too much, so should work. All right, come over here, bounce. All right, cool. We hear the sound effect. Awesome. I think this is what we want. I am noticing something here though. Where's our bounce pad over here? Sometimes you'll see this like unloaded thing. We can always just go over here and click the pin. If we right click pin, I don't know why sometimes it does that for this. I think it's because I moved it around inside my folders. So we'll save it, make sure if we pin it like that, it means it'll stay loaded. So now if we go over here, so there we go. Cool. I don't know if that pops up for you, just know that you can pin it right there. Just right click pin and then it'll stay loaded. All right. So now we can go over here. We can hit the bounce pad. Hear the sound effect. Awesome. We can see it inside the view. And as a designer, we can see like, if we come over here, let's hold Alt and duplicate it and rotate it just to make sure that we can get different directions. So now if we hit play again, we can bounce up, right? Or we can bounce out because we can rotate and we're calculating the local direction, not just world up, which I think is more interesting. And, we can actually change the bounce strength of each bounce pad if we want. But honestly, I think I'm going to turn up the defaults. I think probably want something more like 1500. So we'll just come back in here. We'll change the character bounce strength to 1500. Compile, save. You can see that when we change the default, it actually propagates outward. So just be aware of that. Let's test it out. There we go. I think that feels a lot cooler for the kind of game. Don't worry about that dash. That's a separate tutorial. As long as we're bouncing our character, we've done what we want, and we're ready to continue. So the last thing that we need to do is we talked about having these physics objects that react to the bounce pad as well, because maybe in our level we want to push a thing onto a bounce pad to bounce it up to a higher platform, or we want to be able to push an enemy into a bounce pad or whatever. In that case, it would be a character and be fine, but we do want to be able to push any object that has physics onto our bounce pad. Now, whether you want to allow that or not is up to you, but I want to show you how you could do it using the same blueprint. So what I mean by this is if I take my my little physics actor that comes default in this prototype level, we position it above the bounce pad. If I hit play, since this is not a character, when we test to see if character apply thing, anyways, if we drop our physics actor on top of our bounce pad, you see how it doesn't bounce? We want our characters and our physics actors to bounce. Maybe there's a better way to do this, but the way that I've found works is just to split it and say, look, characters have more complex movement. So if it's a character, move it through that system. If it's any kind of physics actor, then just apply a force on the physics actor, and that'll handle pretty much all other cases, unless you have some weird custom physics. So that's what we're going to do. In the end, we want to be able to drop a physics object and it'll bounce, as well as have our character touch the bounce pad and that bounce as well. So let's set that up. Let's open up our bounce pad. What I'm going to do is I'm actually going to separate this now. I'm going to drag this out a bit. And no matter what bounces, I want it to play a sound. So I'm going to branch this out. I'm going to say, if it's a character, do the character stuff. If it's not a character, so if cast failed, do physics actor stuff. All right, so I'm actually going to comment this just to keep it clear. So I'm going to highlight these nodes over here and say character launch, right? This is just a comment and we can block our code and move it around. All right, so if something overlaps this component, test the other actor to see if it's a character. If it's not, then we need to do something else. So the way to do this is we need to get something called the primitive component on a physics actor or on an actor, and apply an impulse to that physics component. We can apply a force, but forces are meant to be used over time. An impulse is more like a sudden big burst of velocity. And that's kind of what we want, right? We want to bounce the thing. So let's say if our cast failed, I'll drag this down, we want to add impulse, right? And we can add impulse in multiple different things. It doesn't really matter. We're just going to click one of them and remove it. Okay. Add impulse. There's another one that's add impulse at location. If we right click, we'll just say add impulse. You can see add impulse at location. Don't worry about that. We're just going to add impulse to a target instead of at a location, because if we had like an explosion grenade or something, we may want to add an impulse in the world for everything around it. But in this case, I only want to add an impulse to the thing that touched this bounce volume. So we're going to do this one. You could have also right clicked and created the separate. You didn't have to drag off. But if you didn't, when our cast failed, we want to drag into this, right? So if it is a character, launch character. If not, then add impulse. Now what we need to target, we can see right here, target is primitive component, meaning that we need to test the other components, not the other actor. So on our component begin overlap, if the other thing that touched this bounce zone, drag off of other component, drag it in. If the other component is a primitive component, which it should be since we get this overlap event, now we can apply things to that component. So in this case, we want to apply an impulse. Remember, that's going to be a direction plus an amount. We're going to do the same thing over here. You could copy paste, but just for review's sake, we're going to say get our local actor direction All that really matters is however you decide to implement this, that you are consistent between how you launch a character and how you launch a physics component. So get, in this case, it's local up. So get actor, up vector, just like we did up here. Target is self. This is kind of weird. Launching a character actually gives a slightly different result than launching a physics actor. And part of this could also be decided by the mass of the actor or whatever. I think I want designer to have control over that. So I can kind of align and make them bounce similarly, but I want that to be slightly separate since these are two different systems. So I'm going to make a separate variable for physics actor bounce strength. Let's make a new variable and call this physics bounce strength. That. Keep it afloat. We'll also make this instance editable. All right, let's give it a default. I think the physics bounce is slightly lower than the character bounce. I think we need to turn this up a little bit higher. Maybe it's the other way around. I can't remember. We'll give it a default and then we'll change it. So in this case, it's the same as my character bounce default, and then we'll tweak that around. In that case, you could mess with that however you want. All right, so we have our direction. We need to drag in our physics bounce. So get physics bounce, okay. Our strength right here. And just like we did before, we're going to drag off and multiply. So drag that in. It'll convert it for us. We could drag this out a little bit. Apply this into the impulse. I do want a velocity change right here. Make sure you tick that because I don't want to add different velocities to the bounce of the crate or physics object or whatever it is. I want to override that. So we'll do it just like we did up here. Honestly, I think this is it. Once we're done, we still want to play the sound. If we had particles, we would still want to do that. If this is not a character, we want to do a more traditional physics application. So we're going to highlight that, hit comment, say bounce physics object. All right. Okay, I think this will work. There's actually one more thing we have to do to make this work, but it's not quite so obvious. Let's compile, save. If I were to hit play, you're going to see this will not bounce, and then I'll talk about why. Hit play, you see how it doesn't bounce? The reason is because if we want this to work on a physics actor, we need to check that that physics actor is generating overlap events, meaning that that actor will process any kind of overlap event, which is what we have right here, right? On begin overlap. So I'm going to scroll down here and on whatever actor we want to be triggered by this bounce pad. If we want it to work, we need to scroll down to collision. No. Right here. So you're going to find this little event for generate overlap events. Just make sure that's checked. And if that's checked, then our actor will actually receive the message for overlap events, which is what we're doing in code. So make sure that you check that on every single actor that you intend to use this bounce pad in this way. So if we hit play, cool, it works. You're probably going to see how my character bounces higher than my cube. That's why we split our variables into two different ways. So it looks like our character is bouncing higher. So maybe we're going to turn our cube bounce up to match what our character is. Doesn't have to be exact. I think just get a good starting point and then you can customize it throughout your level. Because of the way that we set it up, it's more modular. So I'm going to come back over here. We'll go to our physics object and we need that to be slightly stronger. So we'll say 2000. Compile, save, test it out. Maybe I'm going to drag one more off so that we can compare. And you could also see our sound effect kind of tapers off, right? We don't want to hear it everywhere in the level. And you see there's like slight variation here when it's falling. That's fine. You can make this more complex if you want, just to get the basic bouncing though. I think that's what I was trying to accomplish with this tutorial. So we have physics actors that bounce. We have, characters that bounce. We can bounce in different directions. So if we come over here, if we can hit play, shoot the cube off into the scene. You could imagine like catching it with a physics puzzle or something. You could do some interesting stuff with this. I think that's about it. I think this is all working how I want. And, you could obviously add some particle effects and you could add some other visual feedback. You could start to build puzzles with this. You could expand this, add more options for things to do with your bounce pad. But this accomplishes what I wanted to do. And I couldn't find a good tutorial that did something similar. So I just wanted to share that. So thank you, everybody, and I hope you learned something new in this tutorial.